everybody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to teach you guys how to overlap your letters in graffiti. Now in today's tutorial, I'm going to keep things as simple and as basic as possible as we go through a step-by-step guide on how to apply this. And I'm going to be teaching you guys the formula of how this technique works so you can apply it to any of your graffiti. To follow this tutorial along, you are going to want to know how to do basic 3D, which is isometric forms essentially, and it's a bonus if you understand how to do one-point perspective, although that isn't 100% necessary. Alright, so to kick this off, a few terminologies we're going to have to get pretty familiar with. Let's say we have a normal square like that. That's going to represent our letter. Now, once we add 3D, these lines right here are going to be referred to as our receding lines because they recede back into space. From there, we're going to connect each one of those receding lines with what is called our contour line. Now, our contour line should be as close to a duplicate as the letter itself. As you see, this line right here is pretty much that line right there. And the more uniform you can get those two lines, the better off you're going to be. So what's exactly going on with this effect? So typically in your graffiti that does not overlap, all of your letters exist within the same depth of field. This is to say that one letter is not closer or further away from the viewer than any of your other letters. Let's pretend that each one of these boxes individually represents a singular letter. Normally in graffiti, they create one flat plane. As you can see, the front of these cubes is equal to one another. But by shifting how far away or how close these different boxes are, or these different letters, you can see suddenly they overlap. So if we were to add 3D to these letters normally, it would look a little something like this. But in today's video, we're overlapping, so that means we're going to need 3D to come around here and about there, because this is where our second letter is overlapping the first and the third letter. Now, how do we figure out where the overlaps should actually be in these areas? To figure this out, we're going to start by coming over here to this vertex, and we're going to do the same exact receding line that we have there, and we're going to do it over here. But if you notice, the receding line isn't as large as the other receding lines over here, and that's because it's intersecting the third letter. And once our receding line comes in contact with the third letter over here, that's when we're going to do our contour line. So all we have to do is do our contour line right there and stop once we reach the edge of our third letter. And the reason for that is because we've reached the end of where that interaction takes place. At this point, we need a new receding line to represent the continuation of that 3D. Now here's the thing. This receding line right here and this receding line right there need to be equal in length to the original 3D's length. So to figure this out, it's very easy. All we got to do is just, draw a line over here, and there you go. That's your overlapping 3D. And that also means we can complete this right here. Now something interesting happens here. Because this second letter is closer to the viewer than the third letter is, the 3D stops sooner. It doesn't go as far back. So what happens is this receding line on our third letter reaches further behind the second letter. And when that happens, when we finish our 3D, it gets tucked behind the second letter, which creates a vast amount of depth. It's a great effect and looks awesome. Now what about this area right here? For the purposes of graffiti, typically you would just eyeball it. You would just look at it and go, all right, I want that much of an overlap. Now obviously the amount of an overlap you have cannot be more than the amount of receding line that you have, right? You can't have an overlap over here because, well, the receding line doesn't go that far back. So let's just kind of generalize this whole thing and say, for example, the first letter and the third letter are equally in depth with one another, meaning they're both equal distance away from the viewer. We would begin by drawing the things that we cannot see, the things that are a bit out of our view because they have an object in front of them. So we would finish off this 3D as a sketch. We would erase this line later, and then we would take this intersection right here where the first letter tucks underneath the second letter, and we can draw the same receding line that we have everywhere else, and we could draw it right there. And we would draw it right here as well. This lets us know roughly how much room that we have to play with. So if the first letter and the third letter are within equal depth to one another, then we could just project this line outwards and project it down, and there you go. This is where our 3D would overlap to. So we would come over here, and this would be our overlap all the way down. Now that we've got our overlap here, we take a look at this receding line, and we'd see, all right, the receding line actually ends right there. That's its max distance. We don't want to push this further back because, well, that won't line up with this up here. So we would see a little bit of that verticality, and it would come straight up. From there, all you would do is complete your 3D as normal, and we would delete any lines, or we would erase any lines that are being overlapped, like this one right up here, and the ones over here. And that's the basic idea of how you'd go ahead and overlap. Once we hop into Blender, you can see all of this stuff still holds true. It doesn't matter how we're doing this or what we're doing it with. With Blender, perspective is automatic. I didn't have to draw the perspective, and yet the technique still works. So it doesn't matter if you're using perspective or you're using isometric forms, you'll know that this still works 100% of the time. We have have our first letter on the left, our middle letter right here, and then our third letter over here. And if we look at the second letter, the receding line comes back, and once it meets the form of the first letter, it begins to shoot over to its contour line. And then once that contour line meets the ending of the first letter right here, it begins to recede back into perspective with another receding line. And then once that receding line reaches its maximum depth, you know how far your 3D is going to go, it begins to go back to another contour line until that contour line right back here comes into contact with the next letter's 3D. And then the process starts all over again. You go back to another receding line, back to a contour line, back to another receding line. Now in practice, if we were to draw some letters out of these same exact cubes and retain all the major overlaps that we need for this is what we might have. Now obviously these letters are nothing fancy, it's just proof of concept here, but it demonstrates the point well. You can very clearly see this receding line from the R shoots back. Once it makes contact with the front of the G, it shoots down, and then if we can kind of turn the camera underneath, we would be able to see into this bottom area of the G. And the same thing happens down here, right? The R shoots downwards, we get the receding line, and it gets tucked behind the G once again. As to where up here, we got the receding line, then we got a little bit of a contour line, and then we got the receding line once again, followed by another contour line with the I's 3D getting tucked behind both the G and the R this time. Now, a lot of you guys send me pieces for critiques and you say, man, how do I overlap letters like this? And let's be real, it's really easy. You honestly, you're not going to believe how simple it is. Nothing changes from what we just learned. But what's happening, the science behind what's going on, is all you're doing is you're tilting that letter. And that's what creates that illusion, that sharp cutoff. And because of this, light isn't able to interact with that area in the same way that it might interact with our first letter. And that creates a difference in shading. And that difference in shading is how you're going to differentiate and create this distinctive line right there. Now, yes, in more simplistic forms of graffiti, you can easily just draw a line there. You don't necessarily have to show it with realistic shading. And you can see that right here. We just have a simple line right here in order to show the difference between these two letters. But this isn't enough in order to actually convey the illusion of the letter leaning, especially if you're not shading it. If you're not shading realistically, then you have to listen up to this next tip. Because we want to give the illusion of the letter actually leaning, the 3D has to widen or narrow depending on the lean. If we were to just go ahead and do a straight contour line that was parallel to the actual letter's structure, then it wouldn't look as if the letter's leaning, and as a result, this would look funky. So in order to actually convey the illusion of this kind of lean, that kind of interaction between the two different forms, we have to narrow or widen the 3D according to the lean. So if the letter is leaning into the other letter, then the 3D is going to get more narrow. But if the letter is leaning away from the other letter, then it's going to get thicker and wider. And some of these can get really thin. There'll be plenty of instances where you'll actually have something a little bit more like that, where your receding line and your contour line almost seem to blend together. But in actuality, what's happening is you never actually get to see the contour line, and Blender shows us that beautifully. This is the same recreation of what we just looked at, and you'll see the actual letter structure would be here, and this darker triangle would actually be our 3D. But we never actually get to see the contour line all the way back here, because you'll notice that this is still the side of the square. And when I turn off that layer, you can really see, like, it only comes out to there. Now let's do that thing once again where we create some letters out of these same exact cubes in order to show what it might look like. And once again, you'd see pretty much everything stays the same. We're still using isometric 3D here. None of these receding lines are receding into perspective per se. They're all the same exact angle, and this time we're using a rounded letter. You would see it's really nothing any different. If you understand how to do basic 3D, then you already know how to work with rounded letters, and I teach that in a tutorial for my 3D tutorial. And once we come on over here, we drew a line to distinguish the change in direction from the O to the R. But on top of that, we have a little bit of shading as well, where it's a little bit lighter up here than it is right over here, and it gets even darker still right there, with a little bit of a cast shadow that comes on downward in order to distinguish the forms even more, adding a greater amount of depth. And what's really interesting is, once again, you'll notice in our letter, we still have the letter structure right here, followed by this right there. You don't really get to see any receding line, you really don't get to see any contour line, and this illustrates well how this little triangle gets thicker to thinner as it goes down and closer to the O. Now, a few topics you're going to want to study if you really want to increase your skill and your knowledge on this topic, because there is a lot to learn about this, and it gets a lot more in depth than just a simple tutorial. Study forms, values, shapes, and space. Those 4 topics. Notice, none of those have anything to do with graffiti, but because we're doing graffiti, we're utilizing shapes, and we have to understand shapes in order to create forms. forms, and forms create three-dimensionality, which exists in space. And if we want to realistically shade these things, much like what we have here in these examples, and what you might see in some graffiti I've done in the past, and your other favorite graffiti artists that you might have seen on social media, then you'll notice we oftentimes shade our graffiti. So the more knowledge you gain for these various topics I previously listed, the better you'll get at this. And understand, graffiti does simplify a lot of these concepts to a very watered down degree. So you don't necessarily have to understand how to map out a vanishing point on something that's leaning. While sure, that information is definitely useful and it's not a bad idea to learn it, it's not required for a technique such as this. Not for graffiti's purposes anyway. But dudes, that pretty much wraps up with this tutorial. If you guys want to learn more about graffiti's 3D and how to do it, I got a couple of books I published on those topics, or you can just pick up the bundle book. It's got all of them included into one. It'll teach you how to do basic 3D, one-point perspective 3D, as well as how to shade your graffiti realistically so you can do stuff like this. Once again, the bundle's got it all in there. And if you want the best how to do graffiti tutorials anywhere online, check out this playlist right over here. And I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thank you for watching.